Thank you so much for coming to this presentation from around the world. And it's based on your questions. We have Thangka owners and caretakers from every country, every continent, and I'm at your service to answer any questions you have. Here are a few of the viewers and their questions about thangkas, on which this talk is based. Sharon's asking about thangkas in home. These are a few of our viewers and their questions. Thank you so much, participants, for joining us from around the world. I really feel honored. Let's talk about the thangka form. Thangkas are puzzling. People are asking, what is the function of a thangka? The function of a thangka is to communicate Buddhist teachings. There was a long time in the world when people did not read. And in order to learn about Buddhist concepts and to have a guide to their visualization, the thangkas were used to transmit that information to them. This still goes on. For example, Dodrupshin Rinpoche in Sikkim had a text that had never been illustrated, and he realized that more people would be looking at the thangkas, the pictures, than reading this long text. So he hired a contemporary thangka painting master to illustrate it. Here's an example of the teacher himself, Dodrupshin Rinpoche, and his stylized portrait in the Thangka series. Thangkas and text have a very direct relationship. For example, a lot of blessings and texts are found actually on the thangkas. For example, here on the back is a whole lot of information in text form about this deity. Thangkas themselves are, well, very complicated. As conservators, we call them composite objects. In order to really understand preservation of a thangka form, no matter from what century your thangka is, we have to understand the complicated composite object nature of it. For one thing, the thangka form does not rest easy. It's warring within itself. This is what a thangka looks like to you, and this is what's actually going on with it. The painting panel in the middle, or if it's printed, or even if it's textile, is held in tightly to the textile surround. And the two react differently to changes, for example, in temperature and relative humidity. And sometimes the tension in the stitching is very difficult for the iconographic panel in the middle. So this is what you see, but this is what is going on. So even if a thangka were in perfect conditions, it would begin to deteriorate because it has what conservators used to call inherent vice. Thangkas are actually not just paintings. They're three-dimensional sculptures. The thangka form was developed because great teachers would travel all through the mountains to give teachings to people. Everything had to be rolled up on yaks, the tents, the texts, the robes, the thangkas. So therefore, the thangka form had to be rolled up to go on the yak. And yet this still happens. This is a gar, or well, originally you had the teachers traveling in gar form through the mountains, and now you have gars, which are meetings, dharma meetings, and you see that the monks are still traveling with their thangkas and rolling them up the same way. So when these monks, I was at this session, I said, well, where's your yak? You know, you could travel them flat, and then there'd be a lot less damage. In our workshops in monasteries, we do work with monks and nuns about safer rolling, if rolling is what they have to do. Because rolling and roll storage, in fact, is the primary cause of damage to thangkas. Here's a key question. The Thangka form. Is it a Thangka if it's only just the painting without its textile mounting? And this is a painting by a Thangka master. When you go to most museums, this is what you see as a Thangka. So many people think that this is what a Thangka, I'd call it museum miseducation. There isn't really a label that this is just a painting that was once in a Thangka. Key question. Is it a Thangka if it's only the textile mounting without a painting or any panel in the middle? Most people would say no, but I've been wanting to do an exhibit of Thangka textile mountings. The fact is that in the 70s, dealers and collectors were just taking the mountings off and throwing them away. So I collected them, and they're in my study collection. They were given to me, and I find them so important because they hold the history of textile technology through centuries. The master tailor was as high-ranking in society as the master painter. These days, unfortunately, Thangka paintings are sewn in by machine. The tension's all wrong. In many paintings at the bottom, you'll see a traditional gift of silk to show that silk was highly prized. Shrine rooms, lakhans, gompas are totally resplendent with all sorts of textiles as well as the Thangkas. Often parts of replaced Thangka mountings that a patron wanted to replace the Thangka mountings if they're weak or he wanted to offer a gift, they were made into parts of dance costumes. When you look at Thangka paintings themselves, you see the history of brocade design, which is quite fascinating. Often the master painter himself would do the brocade designs. I know someone asked me how this is done. It's done this way. These days, the artists are using ballpoint pen nibs to do the incision on the gold. Since 1970, I've been interviewing painters, Buddhist teachers, textile artists, meditators, all about thangkas. Again, textile science is so important for a conservator and for you as a collector, because you have to know what you're working with in order to preserve it. I have conservation scientists who are very generous in sharing their toys, and we do a lot of research on Thangka textiles and paintings. I'll be glad to share this with you later if you ask. What's really interesting is early metal thread technology. We're doing research on that around the world. It's often on paper. We also do research on contemporary thangkas to show there's actually no gold or silver in this. Thangkas are a combination of older and newer. Here you see the different lines of stitches to show that this painting had several series of mountings. Let's go through the anatomy of a thangka. Start with the cover. The traditional covers, and if you're fortunate, your thangkas have them, are no longer made. They were hand woven on a certain gauze weave loom, and they're quite interesting. They had a radish stamp and vegetable stamp design. And the quality of the silk is that it has a tooth. In other words, it clings to your fingers, it clings to the painting. Therefore, when we store them for preservation, we like to put an interleaving layer between the cover and the painting. You can see that the cover is actually clinging to the painting. And when I see this, I can hear the paint particles. I can hear them. They're going pop, 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 pop. A lot of covers were ripped off or they deteriorated and not replaced. So your thangka may not have one. Raising the cover is always of interest. This is a high-ranking Kempo, and he's showing us how to raise the cover. It's very formal raising of cover. If you were to do this to an older cover, it would tear in half. In our workshops, we all practice raising covers. Let's go to the door or gate. Again, The thangka, its mounting itself, has its own iconography, which is different than but complementary to the painting. The door or gate located here welcomes you into the world of the thangka. The best quality patch of fabric was used. It's rare that you have the whole mounting with this quality fabric. You could see the door or gate, sometimes at the bottom, sometimes both the bottom and the top, to welcome you in to the world of the thangka. Here's a contemporary door or gate. The next feature of the thangka form is the rainbows. The rainbows extend the radiance of the iconography of the main figure of the deity and these subsidiary figures. This is extending his radiance, or her radiance. These are the rainbows. Usually it's red and then yellow. This is contemporary, and this is quite old, but it's provincial. Sometimes the rainbows fade, but they're usually red-yellow. Some styles of mountings, because thangka mountings are both regional and by choice of the collector or the artist or the monastery. Sometimes they have one rainbow, and this style of mounting has no rainbows. This teacher, Khamtrul Rinpoche VIII, the great painter, he chose to have his own painting framed in a thangka mounting with no rainbows. Let's look at the lining on the back. Often they were chintz. And I know people are doing research about chintz. The lining on the back is something you don't see. It looks baggy because it was made to be slightly baggy, so when it rolls, it does not cause the thangka to constrict. They're made of silk, of cotton, and again, chintz. Often the thangka lining has a window to show you the blessing on the back, but often it does not. This does not mean that the thangka is not blessed, because you can't see the blessing. Also, some thangkas are blessed without any visible signs of blessing. Let's go through the anatomy of a thangka. Other components, you have metal corners, you have wooden dowels with decorative finials, you have cords to hang it up. And the most irritating to Westerners are the hanging ribbons, because they hang in front of the painting. And of course, in Western museum aesthetics, the painting is the most important. So to have these textile elements hanging in front, not good. Here, you can see different types of the tabs hang down, the ribbons. Other components, again, are wood and metal. We're talking about the sculptural form of a thangka. It's not just a painting. It's three-dimensional. And for its preservation, you have to consider all of these elements: metal, wood, silk, leather. The wooden dowel on top often pokes out because the sharp edges tear the edges of the sleeve. On the bottom, the wooden dowel is often removed for framing, or if the thangka is transported to, let's say, an art dealer. We have old decorative knobs. We have new ones, and this wood is put in this wooden dowel to replace one that was removed. The decorative knob can be aged in appearance. This has been sealed. And our next anatomy of a thangka element is this cording, which had been cut when the original dowel was removed. The cording is meant to hold up the thangka cover, but also, as we saw with the rainbows, it runs inside the inner rainbow, around the inner edge, right by the iconographic panel. There's the cording. Also, you have ribbons or leather to hold up the thangka because it was hanging. Here's leather corner to protect the top dowel from poking out, and original cording. Cording is hard to find or replace. Originally, it was made the same way by hand that it was created for use in pujas. and traditionally by nuns. So in one of my workshops, the nuns are creating cording for thangkas for us, for preservation. It's important that if you have leather holding up the thangka, that you realize it could break at any time. It's important to reinforce it. And then their labels. Let's talk about thangkas that are all textile. They actually don't have a painting in the middle. This is from the Royal Palace Monastery Temple in Sikkim. And these thangkas are all textile. It's one of my plans to go there and help do the preservation work on them. This is from the private collection of the Dalai Lama. This is all textile. It's done in a different technique where the fine silk is pasted down to paper. And the reason that's done is often the support, which is also silk textile, usually silk, often cannot bear the weight of the applique decorative elements, which include pieces of brocade and often a lot of gems. Large textile thangkas are especially a challenge for those who are their caretakers. I interviewed the master tailor who made this to find his technique, again, because to preserve, you have to understand exactly what you're working with, the methods and materials, especially so for the sculptural thangka form. This is being raked by light all day. It's huge. It's in a temple. And it was made with white glue, partially. I had asked in my interview if any glue was used, and the white glue is beginning to deteriorate because it was just commercial white glue. Large textile thangkas aren't handled that gently. They're part of the life of the monastery. They're usually shown once a year. And yes, they're meant to be quite sturdy. Here, this is the lining. It's being held up for people to walk through it. This is quite beautiful. It rained the one day a year that it was shown. This is the pulley system if you want to know how they're displayed. Often on mountains or on platforms meant for their display just one day a year. And then they are rolled up like this tightly and carried in a huge leather sleeve and then stored in a monastery storeroom like a large worm in a huge leather sleeve. Unfortunately, if it rained that day, they are rolled up and stored wet within the leather sleeve till the next year. Let's look at paintings. I know everyone loves the thangka paintings. The painting is just part of the thangka form. Is it a thangka if it's only the painting without its textile mounting? Most people would say yes. Thangka painters traditionally were apprentices for their whole childhood. Just like Western master paintings are made by workshops where there's a master and apprentices, it's the same for thangka paintings traditionally. Today, they often paint on walls as well as thangkas. Here are some very accomplished thangka painters who are using Asian paints for the outside of the stupa. And it's really interesting because these paints were a good choice because they have very close to the mineral colors with mineral pigments in them, and they do withstand the elements during the monsoon, etc. This monk is showing us that this wall painting was actually made by thangka painters in their studio and then glued on the wall after. This is quite common. Thangka painters might paint the entire interior of the monastery shrine room as well as a thangka within it. Let's go through the anatomy of a thangka painting. The support, for those of you that know what that means, it is the cloth that it's painted on. You can tell an older thangka support because it was made by hand on a small loom, and therefore you have this seam in the middle. You can't see the seam from the front. It's well disguised with the ground and polished. But if you want to know if your thangka is, well, of a certain age, look for the seam. Also, when I'm doing condition reports on thangkas, I definitely look at the reverse first. I look at the back of the support to see what condition it's in. This thangka looks all right from the front, but with lighting techniques we use, you can see the condition of it. This is raking light from the side and transmitted light. Actually, the thangka support is in extremely fragile condition. Transmitted light shows the very fragile condition of many thangka supports, usually from rolling, unrolling, and roll storage. Usually thangka supports are cotton. Rarely you find a silk one like this. The most amazing silk thangka I saw is horizontal. It's 10 feet long, and it's only this wide because that was the width of an original loom for silk. This is in the Sven Hedin collection of thangkas in Sweden. It's an amazing silk thangka, very, very rare. It's actually because of the rolling and unrolling and the weakness in thangka supports, it was rare that a thangka would be patched traditionally. A painter would be called in when it became unworkable to paint a new thangka with the iconography. Copying is within the tradition. You often get tears in the supports along the seams. Again, on the support, ground was applied. Traditionally, yak hide glue. You can have the ground in black. This was the choice of this great master painter. This is a visionary painting, which was not copied. In other words, the most rare type of painting, for your information, comes from a great meditation master who's also a thangka painter, and it comes from his vision. And it's his choice to use a black ground. There are red ground paintings, but you have to be sure that sometimes the ground is neutral color, but they apply black or red above it. It's one or the other. Good to know for your preservation. The apprentices would have done this. He's applying, mixed the ground with hide glue. He's applying it. He polished it. This takes 2 weeks to do. Apply more, polish it, put it in the sun. And only after that, only after the support and the ground are ready, usually traditionally prepared by apprentices, do you have the design and painting. Usually by iconometric graphs, like this. Sometimes stamped. Then flat colors and shading. People want to know questions about the colors. For a thangka painter, like this great master thangka painter I interviewed, his colors were his most precious possession. He had a family and children, but he treasured his colors. Let's talk about traditional colors. Traditional colors were earth pigments, and the color gradation was achieved by the gradation of the ground. So this is the way a thangka may look to you. But a traditional thangka actually looks like this. In other words, I like to think of it, if you were in an airplane flying over the landscape, you'd have mountains, you'd have the texture of farmers' fields, you'd have lakes, and you'd have, you'd have buildings. So this is the three-dimensional quality of a traditional thangka painting. It's because of the ground pigments and how they're applied in layers. And this is why it's so fragile. We do a lot of research on thangka colors. When you're looking at an older thangka, I want you to think about these minerals. This is what you're working with. We've done a lot of research on traditional thangkas, and this is how we date thangkas. Question, first participant question. How do older thangka differs from freshly painted? Well, of course, time moves on, and you have traditional and contemporary. Even the contemporary thangka master is asking, how long will his thangkas last? In actual fact, I'm really sorry to say this, but traditional thangkas have lasted so long because you had the apprentices who spent so much time preparing the yak hide glue, that was mixed with the traditional pigments. In actual fact, I did an interview of, he's now dead, of an aristocrat from Bhutan who was sent to be a Thangka painter. He was vegetarian, and he spent 4 years making hide glue, distilling the yak glue. And he said it made him ill, the smell of it. But only because of that was the ground and paint layer so resistant to the rolling and unrolling. So these days, if painters are using poster colors, or they're mixing the colors they use, part poster, part commercial hide glue, part pigment, part tube glue, if they mix it all together, then the longevity of their beautiful Thangka paintings may not be as long as traditional. Some styles you find in modern paintings are a grade palette, originally done to look older. Now it's a style, and a pastel palette. These are only done with contemporary paints. You would not have found this traditional Thangkas. Here's a key question. If you have a newer Thangka and it's not even painted, it's all synthetic, is it less spiritually significant than a traditional one? I think the answer to that differs from teacher to teacher. Actually, most people say it depends on the blessing, and if it offers the seed of merit to those who see it, it's perfectly spiritually significant. Fakes and forgeries. Questions on this. This monk is really concerned about fake Thangkas because he feels that people are being robbed by being sold fakes, and also that blessed Thangkas are not being protected and preserved. Let's look at tourist trade Thangkas. The iconography is just not right, and the painting style is not right, and also your support, well, this is painted on something like a bed sheet. It was very large. It had no seams. Sometimes the iconography is just not accurate. There's a whole school of young boys in Nepal who paint these fakes, and there's no true iconography. The mountings are not traditional. And sometimes you see custom seals. Does this mean that it's old and it's approved to leave the country? It's not old enough to have a problem being leave the country, or is it just applied just to make it saleable? How to spot a fake? Look at the reverse. Again, when I examine Thangkas, I look at the reverse. I begin. Look at the reverse. This is just a large piece of fabric with brown dirt rubbed on it. This is damage in unlikely places, not from rolling and unrolling, and dirt applied. This fake, they said that it was from a monastery that the monks had to eat. Please purchase this. It was painted yesterday, actually, by some fakers, and they even tried to make the go look older. You could see the style is not exactly accurate, and this on your right, this is a contemporary but accurate style. I have a whole scientific analysis series on fakes. This is no iconography, but sold for a lot of money. And this is in 14th century in a museum. And as the monk was concerned about older Thangkas, but also about fakes and forgeries, I wanted to see if it was, well, completely overpainted. So I used some post-capture software in my phone to try to analyze what was original and what was not, or if it was all a fake. On the left, someone paid $2,000 for this. It has no iconography. On the right, it's an honest contemporary mandala. I'll tell you the story another time, but it's quite interesting. The most insulting thing is a fake empowerment. This is a key question. If you were in charge of preserving a fake, would you approach it differently if you found out it was a fake than if you knew that it was a blessed empowered object? The Thangka form is evolving. Time moves on. Here's a Thangka form for Celtic iconography. And you have fantastic Thangka painters painting, chronicling the life of recent masters. Change is constant. Now you have traditional mountings with printed centers. You have scroll forms for Thangkas, And you have a lot of digital thangkas, which are fascinating. Copying is within the tradition. So as time moves on, an older thangka, when it became too weak to be used, it would be respectfully retired, and a newer one would be made. So what are you copying, the iconography or the whole thangka style? Digital thangkas. Let's talk about preservation of thangkas in monasteries. I am watching the time. Monasteries are very traditional and somewhat secretive in that what goes on in a monastery stays in a monastery. So when I work in monasteries, I don't leave with any documentation of their thangkas. I teach them how to do the documentation. I completely respect confidentiality. Some things in monasteries are done as they were done centuries for centuries. But then again, things have changed. For example, the caretakers perhaps were caretakers for their life as monks in a monastery. And the next caretaker would get full transmission about how to do it. These days on the rota system, caretakers change fast, and there's not always transmission of where things are and what they are. This is one question that I got before. Please show us monastery context thangkas. We do treasure caretaker training, workshops, preservation in monasteries. We teach risk assessment, disaster planning and mitigation, safer storage, display and handling, digital documentation, and video interview of elders. What we teach in the monasteries for thangka preservation is what you need to know for preservation of the thangkas in your home and offices. Let's talk about sacred art. The question of working with sacred art is very complicated for conservators because on a personal and professional level, you have to decide what defines something as sacred and what it is in the objects you're working with that you are preserving. If you're preserving the blessings, for example, then you may not be free, in fact, to give it cleaning, because you'd be cleaning away the blessings. I feel strongly about that. And if a thangka is in a museum for a long time, does it lose its sacred quality? In monasteries, risk assessment and disaster planning is the way to go for preservation of thangkas. Here are some monks learning about that. What we do is we take, in treasure caretaker training, the scientific approach to risk assessment and disaster planning, and we make it in perfectly practical and low cost in the monastery setting. Every monk and nun has examples of fire, water, criminals, human mistakes, earthquakes. It's very practical. And for preservation of thangkas in your home and office, the same. We added pandemic recently. We wrote an article about dealing with pandemics in preserving your monastery treasures. Here's a question from a viewer. Hello. Our family thangka is kept in subtropic location without air conditioning. How can I keep it from mold and humidity? All right, let's review the risks and hazards. Which risk and hazard is this? Again, does this plastic protect or damage the thangka? Let's review risks and hazards. The risk and hazard for this question is temperature and relative humidity, the mold cycle. Indeed. I would like to do another webinar, just the risks and hazards for thangkas. Henry, who's watching, went to a very important cave of Guru Rinpoche and was concerned about this thangka because water was pouring down the cave wall from the outside. He was very concerned about it. What risk and hazard is that? It's about water damage. And indeed, that is something we can talk about for the preservation of your thangkas. These risks and hazards workshops go very well in monasteries because they're practical and low cost. Storage is so important for thangkas in monasteries and also for your home and office. However, In monasteries, there's a whole component of the sacred. Something is not less sacred when it's in storage than it is when it's on display. Storage techniques cause a lot of physical damage. Sometimes thangkas are respectfully when they're with reorg, which you had previous webinar. I did a reorg session on thangka storage rooms, and it's my goal to go to thangka storage rooms with the reorg method and make practical and low costs upgrades to protect the thangkas. We can use locally found materials. Here, this market cloth has been boiled and hung out to dry in the sun and used for storing textiles, because after all, acid-free paper does not work in monsoon weather. And this is a shop in Nepal, just on the street. It has a lot of good materials for storage. These masks are hung on the wall. Perhaps we could upgrade with a cardboard box. This is a Dharma center that's hung its thangkas. However, they're right by a door, so anyone walking through bumps right against them. Documentation is so important for your thangkas, both in monasteries and your home and offices. We do a lot of documentation, both written and on mobiles. She wants to know how documentation protects thangkas from future disasters. Well, the fact is that so many monks and nuns have, come to harm. When there's a disaster, they run around the monastery looking for the precious thangkas to save them at their own peril. And that's why documentation of what thangkas you have, where they're located, what thangkas you have, where they're located, and how they've been treated is so important. And also, if you have disaster or if a thangka is damaged by rolling and unrolling, the future generation should have pictures of it and the history of it. It's all in the documentation. The problem is that if we worked with some caretakers and then I go back, and this is one monastery, I have been to that monastery all these years and continue going. Every year I work with new caretakers. We go over the same things. That's why documentation is so important. Documentation is in all languages. I can easily provide whatever you need for your own documentation in monasteries or home offices in your language. Documentation is by video and by your digital camera. All of the monks in our workshops practice giving lectures on their documentation. We also insist that the elders are documented by video. This nun and others talk about the history of the thangkas in their nunnery. And your grandma could talk about the history of your most precious belongings, your home and office. And unless you video her talking about that, that history might be lost to your grandchildren. Thangkas in monastery. Traditional usage combined with traditional techniques. Thangkas in museums. Well, there's excellence in display, handling, and storage, but it's non-traditional aesthetics. When I first worked in museums in India, for example, there was a continuity between monastery and museum, and some people would come to do pilgrimage in the museum and have smoke offerings and everything to the thangkas. And now, where museums used to be sterile, actually, it's going the other way. This is a beautiful shrine room in the Rubin Museum in New York, where museums are offering information about how thangkas and other sacred art would look in a traditional context. So it's come full circle. This is quite admirable. Thangkas in museums are often displayed in a sterile presentation. However, we can learn a lot in that from museum tricks, we have the plexi case to keep, the visitors away from touching, and to also to keep the climate, temperature and relative humidity, which is monitored to keep it stable. If you have leather hanging cords which might break, they're reinforced. Little clips to hold up the weight of the thangka so it doesn't tear. Sharon, who's watching, wants to know about framing. Yes, we learn a lot from museums about proper framing. although sometimes in museums you might think that this is the entire Thangka form. A good way to do it, and this is an early museum framing I did in the 1970s for the full Thangka form. It's set back in a shadow box. We can learn a lot about handling from museums. They're very, very careful. And the museum people, the conservators, the curators, they're excellent in handling. This Thangka could not be stored flat, but the curator is and conservator are rolling it around something, so it's not crushing itself. We learn about shipping flat, and we learn about storage. This would not work for monasteries with the monsoon and pests. But this is excellent storage in the Rubin Museum of Art. It's a work table, and this thangkas are stored flat. Thank you, Rubin Museum, for use of these pictures. Again, you could see this would be the ideal storage. And the thangkas are interleaved between each other and also between the cover and the painting. Of course, in monasteries in the monsoon, we'd use cloth, not paper. Thank you, Rubin Museum, again. And they've all been inventoried. American Museum of Natural History has fabulous Thangka storage. This would be ideal for all monasteries if they could only afford it. Donors, please consider it. They're sealed up against pests, and they have these drawers for the thangkas where they're laid flat, and they're perfectly safe. You can get low-cost copies of this. This is just a repurposed natural history case, and you can make them yourself from acid-free materials. You can make storage that is earthquake-proof at low cost, very low cost. For your home and office. Here's a question. Works hanging in our home and office. In our home. And how do you protect family thangkas in a home with children, as baby Theo? The preservation of thangkas in your home and workplace, well, it's a combination of respect and actual usage in monasteries and the techniques of preservation from museums. So it's a combination of that. For your home and office, for your thangkas, please do a risk assessment and disaster planning. You have to know the risks of your thangkas and what you'll do if there's a fire and what you'll do if the roof leaks to save your thangkas. Document your thangkas for future generation, even for insurance purposes. And also interview the elders about the history of them. Safe for storage, handling, and display in your home and office context. Here's a quick summary. We're almost out of time. In your home and office, rolling and unrolling your thangka is the most harmful thing you can do. Rolling compresses the delicate paint layers and the layers of chalk and hide glue they rest on. The paint layers will crack and fall off, and the textile will tear. Thangkas can be transported and stored lying flat. It's best to hang up your thangka and not roll it after that. Don't pull on your thangka to try to adjust the shape if it's not flat, because thangkas are three-dimensional sculptures. These are all for the home and office owners. Be careful raising the cover because your finger may touch the painting as you go up, and also the covers are delicate. Hang your thangka out of direct sunlight, not over heating or air conditioning element. Even a bright spotlight on it can direct heat towards it and cause irreparable heat and light damage. Resist the temptation to clean your thangkas. Thangkas are not dirty and do not need to be cleaned. Here, baby Theo will soon be splattering baby food on his thangka. Here in the office, the light is damaging it and the paper files are scratching against it. And here in a hallway, the people walk by and scratch the thangka. Risk assessment, please. Treatment options. Question, we're near the end of our time. I wish we had another hour. Conservation treatments for both the painting and the textile. This is my main message to you, besides not rolling the thangkas, please prevent damage from occurring. If a thangka is damaged, stabilize its condition. Never try to make an older thangka look as if it were painted yesterday. Respect the evidence of traditional usage of a sacred art form. Thangkas are not dirty and cannot be cleaned. Repainting a thangka because you want it to look clean and new is never successful, and you create permanent damage, as you do if you try to clean it. If you want a new looking thangka, hire a thangka painter to paint a new thangka and preserve the original thangkas with safe storage, handling, and display. Cleaning does not work. Textile mounting replacement, a lot of questions and advice. Parts of the textile mounting as you're working on them. The cording is difficult. Preservation does not mean to change an old thangka into a new thangka. Thangkas are a combination of older and newer. We have a lot of traditional mending and preservation. There's the gluers and the menders. It has to do with the thangka you're working on. Maybe just stabilize. Mixing old paintings and new mountings, again, the thangka form is at war with itself. At the best of times, the painting, that iconographic panel, wars with its textile mounting. So if you put an old painting in a new mounting, it's going to cause destruction. Or a new painting in an old mounting. It's difficult. They're not comfortable with each other. Here's some simple mending by nuns, because their thangkas were needed in their nunneries for everyday use. These thangkas were probably worth a fortune on the market. They were the workhorses in the monastery. They were used for traditional purposes, and they had to be in working order. And the nuns did a fabulous job. In museums, we do that too. Again, if you're working with preserving your thangka, the covers are very difficult. This cover took a year for preservation. I don't think many owners could do that these days. Here are some options. We're almost out of time. For your painting support. Well, all of these options are very technical. And with conservators, we can have another webinar about this. But you have to be very cognizant of the fact that you don't want to change the nature of the original thangka. In other words, by infusing it with paste or infusing it with synthetic. Water's an enemy of a thangka. Here's a restorer who sprayed the whole thangka with water and used food paste to line it. This is difficult for a lot of reasons. For one thing, the three-dimensional quality of the thangka was lost as the ground and paint layers sunk into the support. Mylar was used in the back so you could see the blessings that had problems. Sometimes it's best just to use patches. Okay, new thangka supports. Well, Fred, it will last as long as how you treat it. 300 years is if you put it in a drawer in the dark in perfect conditions. 50 years is if baby Theo splatters his baby food on it, or if your cat scratches it, or if you have it in bright light. Consolidation, again, technical for conservators. Let's have another webinar and discuss this. You don't want glistening synthetic. Cleaning and in painting. Please just stabilize. Don't overclean with water. Technical, thangka in painting. Not even a meditation master knows all the iconography for all the lineages. It is very questionable if you fill in hands, their mudras, faces, what the hands are holding, iconography. Very questionable. I believe in stabilizing the thangka and then doing digital restoration. In other words, you keep the original stable, and then you can have a high quality digital print and work with that. Please stabilize the condition of the original and then reproduce the original. In conclusion, I really want to say that by understanding that the Thangka form is so diverse and challenging, in fact, a Thangka is many forms and is still evolving. We can use risk assessment, disaster planning, documentation, safer storage, display and handling to preserve our thangkas, monastery, museum, home, and office. We want the thangkas to continue to serve their function in our monastery, museum, home, and office, and we want to offer them respect. I am at your service in the future. Please send me your questions, and I hope to have more webinars like this. Thank you so much.